Hi everyone. I think we're live now. God, this is weird. This is the first time that I've projected my front-facing camera, and it's really weird to see the lip sync when you do these live events. So before introducing our speaker today, we are trying to put the next program of work together. And one of the things that we're doing is I just wanted to crowdsource some info around some of the topics that you guys want to hear. In the past, one of the things that we've tried to do is to have to split up the talks so that on a 3-month cycle, we have one Microsoft speaker talking about something new and novel, and there's a lot of new services that are coming out post Ignite that you're going to hear about at the end of the year. So I've already booked some really interesting speakers for the end of the year when those announcements come. One of them's from the product team, and the other thing that we like to do was to get customer speakers. Some of you might have come to the Reactor talk where we got Clearbank. So, you know, we want to get end users of Azure to discuss what they've done, to discuss, you know, what impact Azure has had on their business and how they've built their architecture and made their technical decisions. And then lastly, we wanted to have community speakers, maybe talking about some cool OSS projects that you guys have done. And so I think, you know, on that note, you know, looking for all three continuously. So anybody that's there from Microsoft, feel free to get in touch. Anybody that's a customer that's using Azure and wants to talk about this, or anybody from the community that's working on an open source project that's cloud-based. You know, love to hear from you. I'm just going to go to because I can see that we've got a bit of an active Q&A now, so I'll just these. Nobody's actually said anything. Can I just let's just go to that question again. Trying to put a program together for the next few months. Can I get some suggestions of topics, subject matter, that sort of thing that you guys would like to see, because we're about to publish the next quarter's talks. Did anybody, for example, see anything in Ignite that interests them in terms of services that they want to hear more about? Just write in the Q&A section. And we have something. Azure security. Okay, fantastic. Specifically, was that you know, there've been some announcements around Defender. We had a talk a while ago on the SIEM, the Security Incident Event Manager, Azure Sentinel, but I know the product team for Sentinel, and I'm more than happy to send out an invitation. Is that is that something that someone that you guys would want to see? Azure Sentinel. Okay, so we've got all right, so I'm going to log down a Sentinel call, and we'll add that to the presentations in the next 3 months. I'll get someone from the product team. Programming in Python. So would it interest you guys if we ran a session with a speaker around Python in Azure Functions? That's from Simeon Abraham. Would a talk like that be interesting? Okay. Mark has suggested we have a talk on synapse. I think that's definitely warranted. Microsoft are really pushing Azure Synapse Analytics, and just recently I delivered a course on this, and so there's probably quite a lot of content that they can deliver back around the integration of Spark and SQL Data Warehouse. And the new integrated Synapse Studio environment. So we've got 3 topics there. We've got topics as pipelines as code, which is really the discussion point of today. Power apps, okay. Interesting. I guess we could find. It might be interesting to find a customer that's done a Power Apps implementation where they've used that with Azure. I think at Envision last year I saw Unilever present. So maybe what we could do is find another customer. Because this is becoming a common pattern now to use to build Power Apps and then create backend services in Azure. So, Andy, I hope you're taking notes with all of these things. I think we've got 4 talks. Brilliant. So, somebody anonymous has said Sentinel is interesting. Maybe also tools like SCA. Sorry to appear stupid. Could you just describe SCA? Okay, I'll wait for that definition of SCA. Case studies of real world projects done in Azure are always good, and any new features. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that some of the best events that we've had have been where customers have talked about their journey in Azure. Like I say, I mentioned the ClearBank. That ClearBank came to speak to us about this, and I want to find more of these. And as more and more people use Azure, we'll have that level of diversity. So yeah. Also, I'd be interested in ingesting and handling events, Event Hub, Event Grid, IoT Hub, any others. Okay, perfect. Andy, do you think we might be able to get somebody from the IoT team to speak?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's been a few updates to IoT recently, hasn't there? A whole bunch of stuff. Sphere, the Guardian, which are worldwide. GSM 5G connected SIM cards that you can plug into an Azure Sphere, and then just roll them out into production. That's a pretty cool thing that came out in Ignite. Can we get somebody from the product team to come down? Yeah, I guess we could. There's also a whole bunch of new stuff around digital twins, which is something that Richard knows I go on about a lot, and that's why he's horribly bored of hearing it. But I might have to make him listen to it again in a formal session with. Which is like the graph database for Azure, right? It's kind of interesting. I know there's already one inside with Gremlin on top of Cosmos, but it's like a standalone graph DB targeted around IoT, which is pretty cool. I guess we can go over that. Get some of those guys to come talk to us too. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think about some of the stuff that came out around the Azure data stack like the serverless Cosmos DB that came out at Ignite, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could coerce someone from Microsoft to speak about that. We've got contacts in that area. So yeah, absolutely. Some of the new features as well, not just even around serverless, but around being able to use tied to sort of role-based access controls for access, as opposed to keys, and all of these sort of micro features which have been batched into the latest releases. I think would be quite interesting. Yeah, definitely.
Definitely get one of Mark Brown's lot, right?
I was just thinking, yeah. I was just thinking one of Mark Brown's lot. Somebody, who was it? Who was it that came to the group? Oh
yeah, Chris Anderson, didn't we? And
yeah,
a bunch of guys, didn't we? Came to great Cosmos talk for us a while back. I think they've all gone up in the ranks these days. They might be too lofty to talk to.
too important.
I've forgotten their roots.
Absolutely. I did, because I wanted to hear a talk on this anyway, and because it's a client that I'm using all the time. I did reach out about a week ago to the PM for Azure Data Studio to see whether she'll give us a talk. So you know, it's getting a lot of ground for the purposes of, you know, being able to flip between SQL and Custo and notebooks, and it's you know, that Azure Data Studio is becoming that sort of one size fits all, you know, that very sort of generic thing which does lots of different things quite well, but you know, not specific to anything in particular. So it's got that very pluggable model like Visual Studio Code has, and it's quite lightweight, and it's if you haven't used it before, it allows the use of these extensions, and Microsoft are writing more of these extensions. So I thought, I've been using it quite a lot recently, so I thought that I'd invite one of the program manager.
Yeah.
So
good. Well, that's Azure Orbital. That was something which I'm not sure anyone ever asked for, but Microsoft released anyway. It'd be quite interesting to know why there's now a service on Azure that you can click and spin up that lets you communicate with physical satellites.
I saw that as well. I mean, that's a pretty bold ambition, isn't it?
It's pretty cool.
They didn't really publish very many details.
No, like, who wants this? This is a thing.
Yeah, or the pricing from what I could see.
Not enough room on the screen for all those zeros, I'm sure.
I think it's going to be exorbitantly expensive, but yeah, it would make a really good session. So the SCA, I actually did call it. I was too embarrassed to say it just in case I got it wrong, because I do work in security and data, but security code analysis. So you know, I think maybe some of that, if that's referring to static and dynamic analysis, you know, we've used platforms like Checkmarks and Black Duck in some of the projects that I'm in. So we'll try and get something together with that. It's also pretty topical to the pipelines talk that we're talking about, because most of these pipelines will have now a security component, a code analysis component. Joel says, I'm guessing I didn't miss the start then. Well, if the start is Andy and I waffling for about 10 minutes, then you didn't. But this is really good feedback for us. So we never get to ask people what they actually want to listen to. We just impose things on everyone. So this is great feedback. Microsoft Graph as well. I'm using that all the time. I'm just wondering whether we can, whether we can invite someone, maybe from a customer actually, because some of the work that I've been doing uses the Microsoft Graph to, and not just the graph, things like Office activity logs, you know, and other Microsoft data to basically understand threats. But I'm also using things like the Azure Resource Graph as well. Okay, so publish that. Drew says we can speak about our current recent WVD deployment and how we migrated away from Amazon Workspace, mostly for extra visibility and easy logs in Sentinel. That would be a great talk from a personal perspective. So Drew, absolutely, please reach out to us. From a personal perspective, I think that the Sentinel connectors into AWS don't really consider the volumes of data that need to be exported, and I've always wondered whether it might be quite prudent for Microsoft to write agents to filter things out, because having done some work with Sentinel, I've seen that that it's very easy to start really raising your egress costs in Azure. So yeah, definitely, please reach out to us. And okay, so John says, from a purely selfish perspective, Azure AD B2C would be interesting. We did have a great talk, didn't we, on that by, was it Marco De Sanctis?
Yeah, we did.
So we can invite Marco back, can't we?
Yeah,
I think Marco's an Azure MVP. I think he talked about that in a client environment, so it would definitely be a good call. So I am going to take note of that. Joel says SCA tools comparison would be good. Snake versus Dependabot versus etc. Okay, cool stuff. And Simeon says also the whole Azure DevOps. Oh God, now they're coming in thick and fast.
Also Defender's box.
I know. Also, the whole Azure DevOps until start pipelines of Kubernetes with all the elements, ISTIO, Terraform, etc. Okay, definitely. DevOps is really, really interesting, and I'm looking forward to tonight's talk. And I won't hog any more than the next sort of few minutes until we get to the point where I've just published all of the things that we're going to use to build our new speaker list over the next 6 months now. But I think it's it's an incredibly powerful pull, because everybody has to do it now. It's that sort of intersection point where it doesn't matter whether you're a data scientist, a software engineer, whether you're working in infrastructure. It's that connection point. Okay, so let's publish that. Divyesh says Delta Engine for Azure Databricks was announced, but is in preview. Anything on this would be of great interest. Databricks is awesome, and this is more of a personal request. Totally with you there. We can definitely get a talk on that, and we can probably get Databricks to talk about that as well. Matt Thompson, a really good speaker, ran the Spark users group and does a lot of community activity for Databricks. So I think it's probably been about 2.5-3 years since we had a session with Databricks. So I think that's definitely warranted. And there's a lot of new announcements that Databricks have done, and we haven't actually had a talk on Delta Lake, but I think a talk on all of the new things that are going on, including some of the advancements in Spark and the Photon engine and other bits and pieces, would be great. So we'll definitely add that to the stack. Andy's responding to, you're responding to this now, yeah. Blazor and static web apps. We did have a talk on this, didn't we, Andy?
We had Dave with talk.
Yeah, that's right. I think we've had a few talks, and we had another one on Blazor. So there is a Blazor one that's actually sitting in our YouTube channel. I forget who did it, but there are. But yeah, it's worth checking that out. But I'm sure that we can have another one. Joel, here's one too. Has anyone had any experience of megadata uploads to Azure via post? So Databox and the old Azure Expert. So actually, I have some customers that have some experience with that. It's a pretty dry subject to talk about, because there's like a boring set of steps that you have to adhere to with Databox. But we could maybe have a partial session on that, because it is an important consideration when you have a huge amount of data, or potentially one of the things that Microsoft are reporting accelerating is a lot of data center migrations into Azure now. So I hadn't really thought about this now, but it is probably quite relevant given the pandemic. So yes, let's publish that. DevOps, I think it would be useful to discuss tools for managing feature toggles. I think we had a talk on that, didn't we?
I think we did.
Yeah. Cognitive services use cases. Yes, I think we could. I think that there are some customers that we could speak with about this, that we might be able to coerce. I think that's a good call too. Oh my God, there's some great feedback. I can't actually remember the last time that we asked this question, and every single month we struggle. Oh, what do people want to hear? And there is so much content here. Sorry, I'm just going to publish all of these things so that you can see this. All right, very good. Right, so now just to introduce our speaker and our topic of choice tonight. Many of you will have used Azure DevOps. We've had several talks on DevOps in the past, and I think one key thing that everybody had to get used to was that move between Classic and YAML. Our speaker today, Sandy, some of you may know him because he's spoken for us before, and he's done lots of cool stuff, which he shouts about on Twitter. So the crux of this talk started because Sandy published something that we've been calling Data Platform in a Box, which was a way of us taking all of the Azure resources to do with Data Platform and putting some security controls and constraints around them, so that out of the box they would use things like managed identities, and that, you know, as when security assessors use different sets of controls like the C-Star Alliance and others, you can have like an audit trail based on the infrastructure as code that you have, and the security controls. So so it was born out of that need for, I think, developing something that literally embodied controls, so that you would be able to spin up things like Azure Databricks and data lake stores where and SQL DWs, where everything was very precise on the, you know, on RBAC models and other things like POSIX style ACLs on the data lake, and so that you took like all of the manual controls and headache away, and a lot of the multi-stage pipeline was actually born out of this project. So I've sort of seen the genesis of this, and I'm sure Sandy will touch on this today. So without further ado, let me hand over to Sandy, who will share his screen now and begin.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Sorry, I just need to give permissions on my Mac to share my screen.
Sandy, we all okay here? Sandy, Sandy, I think we've got a problem with audio.
Is that better?
Yeah, you're pretty soft, but I don't think anything you said for the last 5 minutes was heard.
Okay.
Okay.
At the very start, or from like halfway through?
Until just now.
Oh, okay. That's really frustrating. Yeah, sorry about that then, guys. So I guess I will ramble a tiny bit again. So what I'm essentially going to do today is just talk through multi-stage YAML pipelines and how they've evolved over probably the last 2 years, very much in the same way that Storage Gen 2 has evolved over the last couple of years to be a really well-rounded product. So I'm not going to bother talking about who I am now. It's basically just on the screen. So what I'm going to do basically is jump straight into a demo about the things that I want to talk about, because with DevOps, I always find that drawing things out and creating pictures and things like that is a really tedious exercise. What it's usually better to do is just to talk through what this is, what we're trying to solve with this, and how we can actually go and use this damn technology. So where I want to start is just is laying the scene from where Microsoft were in Azure DevOps just a few years ago. So for those of you who don't know, Microsoft had quite a strong split in the concept of what they called build pipelines, which are now just called pipelines, and release pipelines. And you can still kind of see that we're still in this intermediary phase where we haven't fully deprecated the old technology and we've not fully implemented the new technology. So I'm just going to give like a quick overview of what it used to look like. So this is still how we would kind of expect to see our pipelines. So we can see that these are some of the pipelines that we have in one of our Azure DevOps resource projects, which is just a scratch pad for our Nottingham team. So if I come into this Spark Excel, not that one, the Spark Utils, sorry. What we can see is just the runs history that this goes over, when it was triggered, the actual time that it takes, and things like that. So we can come in and we can see more of the run detail. And this is now where we start to see that it looks a little bit more kind of new than the previous version of pipelines. This is usually where we'd come in to our old build pipelines and we'd come in and we click edit and then we'd be greeted by a GUI, right? Whereas now we're not. Now the default for pipelines, when you create a new pipeline, tends to be YAML, right? So you've got your YAML, YAML, YAML. It's actually really
Sorry, Sandy, we're not having a lot of success. You've muted. Can you unmute?
No.
Yep. Sorry, there's been a few comments. Could you, on your browser, can you increase the zoom?
Yeah.
Perfect. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. So yeah, this is the old-fashioned experience that we would be greeted with within pipelines. So it'd be very, very interactive. We'd come in, add an agent job, say that we wanted to do something in .NET Core. We'd say we'd want to do a build, or most likely like a restore and a publish. Then we'd say where our arguments are, things like that. We'd create a load of steps. That would be our pipeline. We'd save and queue that. Off we go. What Microsoft first started doing was just having this little view YAML, right? So this was their little teaser to say, well, you know, you can still do it old-fashioned, but here's the YAML, just in case you want to think about going to kind of new age. And if we leave that and just come back to the YAML that we're going to use as a quick example, then we can see that Microsoft also built in the inverse as well, right? So you have YAML, but you don't have to be one of those script kiddies who are dope with YAML, who literally understand everything about it. And it's like, oh, can you go create me a cloud formation, or can you go create me like a Terraform with all the YAML and just know all the commands off the top of your head? That's not realistic, right? I'm not going to know what all of these tasks do off the top of my head. So what we have now is, instead of needing to go to the reference documentation, we can just click and say, do you know what? I want that same .NET Core. I want to publish. I want this as my argument. Boom, add it back in. And that's there for us. The cool thing about this is we can come back in and we can start to mess around with this if we need to as well. So if we need to change some of these tasks, we can come back in and we can change some of the settings. And that works for any of the things that have been built before, right? So it's a much, much better experience in terms of YAML. It's not just here's a blank page, go and build some actual YAML. So really good. And this is something that Microsoft have pushed for quite a while now, the build in YAML. Most people should be familiar with this, because this is how they still try to serve you creating a new build pipeline. And it's really useful, right? So you can have a master pipeline where you're just building your .NET app, right? Your web app or whatever it is, and that's all you need to do. Then as part of your development effort, you go, actually, we need a database as well. So how do we want to do that? Do we just want to have a hacky DB maybe at the start? But what we need to do after is to package all of that up. So we're probably going to want to create some form of DAC pack. We're going to have a database project that we need to build as well. The really, really cool thing with pipelines, YAML pipelines, is that we can start to edit other branches as well, and we can have different builds in different branches. So when we start to add additional features that may be not just .NET anymore, maybe we add an extra project that we need to deploy somewhere, we want to build it using a different runtime, anything like that, we can start to say, okay, here's my development branch. My development branch has a database. Boom, bang, ping. Now it builds dev, and it builds dev with the DB. It's not going to fail your master build because you've not pushed it to master yet. Awesome. Old-fashioned, you'd have to first commit to master, get it PR'd, get all of that done. Then you'd have to think about, okay, now I need to update my build. So this is much, much better. It's more succinct, and it's just more natural in terms of how we develop as well. So for Microsoft, the next piece was releases, right? So this is our old-fashioned release interface. And what we would have is we'd see our stages that we'd usually name like dev, test, prod, something like that. And to be quite honest, the way that I did this, I genuinely still don't know if there's a better way. But the way that I would do this is I'd have my dev, right? So you'd have your dev stage. And when I needed to go and deploy to test, I'd just go create a copy, Because do you know what? 9 times out of 10, apart from things like running my automation testing that I might be doing in my test environment, updating parameters, which we can obviously use variable groups for, I'd just be doing copy and paste. Most of it is exactly the same. What I'd usually end up doing when I updated my actual development environment with some new packaging concept or whatever I needed to do, whether I was deploying a new ARM template or I was deploying this DB, I was deploying something to Databricks, I'd add the stage here, I'd save it out, and then I'd just go to my pipeline and just copy it again. I never really found a good way of taking my changes from dev to test to prod without just deleting these two environments and building a new copy. So this is what I want to talk about, really. This is where the concept of multi-stage YAML pipelines actually starts to come into its own. It means that how we have this concept of stages within the old-fashioned release pipelines, we can start to have that same concept of stages within our build pipelines, or what we call now the multi-stage YAML pipelines. And again, the great thing that we can do here is it's all linked into Git. So if something significant changes, then we can make that change in Git, and it doesn't have to affect what the rest of our pipeline is. We don't have to think about, okay, I've made the change on my dev part of my build at release, but I haven't made it on test, I haven't made it on production. And just thinking about that lineage is much, much simpler in this way. So I have a quick example of one of the original versions of multi-stage YAML pipelines that I did. And it's just, again, using the kind of same old standard. I want to deploy to development, then I want to deploy to test, I want to deploy to production, right? So it's just perfectly flat, perfectly linear, but there's nothing stopping you doing whatever kind of branching you want to do. So, for example, if you have a larger team, there's nothing stopping you here having your build stage and then having 3 development deploys, right? If you need to do that for your use case, it's fine. You can do that in the YAML. I'll show you that. The same with test. If you want to come from your one dev and you want to deploy to a test environment, then a QA or a UAT environment, you can totally do that. And you can link your prod to deploy from wherever as well. So if we just quickly drop into this pipeline, what we'll start to see is comparing the previous, comparing the previous pipeline that we were in the utilities. In the utilities, we just defined a single job, right? So we come in, we set our pool, and we don't even set a job. We just say these are the steps that I want it to run. I want it to do some PowerShell. I want it to do some more PowerShell, more PowerShell, more PowerShell, publish some tests, publish some code coverage, copy some files, and then publish a build artifact at the end. So this all just runs in a linear fashion. There's no concept of stage here. There's not even a concept of job, which is quite a useful concept as well. And one of the first things that you'll notice when we come to the multi-stage YAML pipelines is it's exactly as it kind of sounds. We're adding this concept of stage back in, which is really, really useful. It allows us to create that flat lineage, moving through our build stage, to our dev deployment, to our test deployment, to our production deployment, and anything else that we may want to have in between. So our build is very, very simple. We just do a Docker build. So we pull an image repository from a container registry, which is an Azure container service. And the last thing that we're doing is uploading our manifest files. So this will just publish it in our build artifact. So our manifest is just telling our Kubernetes instance what we actually want to do with these services, right? They're just our service description YAMLs that we use kube control to deploy in Kubernetes. And then we start to think about deployment instead. So we'll have our development deploy stage, right? And again, it all just looks similar. We have this concept of stage. We're doing a few additional things. So what we're saying is this has a depends on chain, which means that our stage will only run after a successful run of build. So it's just telling it what the actual trigger mechanism is. In the same way that at the top of our build, we can define what actually triggers the first stage. So we're saying that the trigger is a change in master using the repository that is itself. So that's what triggers our build. And then deploy dev is triggered again by the build. All we're doing here is deploying to a Kubernetes service. So yeah, we will deploy the manifests that we are taking in from our artifact build stage as well. And then what you'll quickly notice, and this is where the kind of next concept that we're going to look at is that we have a test stage, and that test stage looks exactly the same as development, right? So there's nothing different. The only differences realistically between dev and test are the words dev and test and what the dependency is. So we're saying that the dependency is on the build dev stage. So if we wanted our deploy test to run concurrently with dev, and we wanted it to be essentially fan out, so we had two different copies of dev running at the same time, we could just change this to depending on build. So we could say that this is deploy dev 2, and that's what's going to happen, because the depends on is the key for us here. It's how we create our lineage between our stages. So what this will do, if we deploy this and save this and commit it now, it will create two build stages. Sorry, it will create two dev stages that come off the build at the exact same time. So if I just change this back, and then again, we have production, and production is exactly the same, right? So it's all just copy paste code at this point, or YAML, with just the changes between the names of the environments. So those of you that are familiar with CI/CD in pipelines, and maybe more the traditional release pipelines, will probably notice that there is some concept missing from here. And that's the kind of authorization and how we do authorization between the environments. So the way that we would do it in the old-fashioned release pipelines is that we would have a gated approval, right? So we could set on our gated approval before we trigger a new environment. We can set what the actual triggers are, but we can also say that, do you know what, we need an approval from Sandy before stage 2 test, whatever you're calling it. Before that is actually triggered, we need to have this person sign that off. If you didn't have that, all that would happen is that once your first stage had completed, it would kick off your second stage. Straight away, it would deploy straight there, which is going to be a huge issue for you if you have a really nice pipeline that's going deploy to dev, deploy to test, deploy to prod, and you just submit a PR to master that gets through because all your unit tests pass, but maybe none of the integration points do. You've changed your ARM templates to delete all of your services, for example. That's then going to deploy straight to dev, straight to test, straight to prod, and someone's probably going to be pretty upset at you, which is probably one of the only reasons that you might be happy that you're still working at home, because at least they can't shout at you in person, right? But anyway, so what this does is give us that layer of protection. So whether it's approvers, it can be groups as well. So there's probably an ElastiCloud kind of group. Yeah, so ElastiCloud Energy team, right? So we can say that somebody from the ElastiCloud Energy team has to approve this before it actually starts to get into production. And then there's all sorts of additional approval steps that you can set with this. So like a user can't approve their own deployment, which is probably a good one to have, certainly on production. And you can set multiple approvers as well. So I could set Richard Conway as a second approver for this as well. So it would require us both to do that. And then some of the additional things that you can start to do when your CI/CD is getting more complex, more kind of fancy, more automation driven, is you can start to think about how you add gates into this as well. So you can do all sorts of things here, because it's starting to throw out to Azure services. So you can invoke Azure functions, REST APIs. I hadn't actually seen this Azure ML published pipelines before. I'm sure there's all sorts of weird and wacky things that you can do with that. It might be some interesting things to do with regression testing that you could do there. Model drift is probably another good example. So there's all sorts of weird and wonderful things that you can do. And if there is kind of one thing that I think is less intuitive about YAML compared to the old-fashioned pipelines, I'd probably say it's this, right? So in your old-fashioned pipelines, it's pretty easy to see, okay, here's my dev approver, here's my prod approvals or test approvals. You can see that all in one nice place. Not so easy in YAML. Still possible. You just got to look somewhere slightly different. So if I come back just to to this YAML, it's not actually in YAML, which is the kind of frustrating part here. So what you now have is two concepts. So you have the concept which is kind of new, which is environments. And then you also have what we should be relatively used to if we're doing deployments to Azure, and we've ever been doing deployments to Azure, and that's service connections. So environments allow us to see kind of multiple releases to the same inverted commas environment. It doesn't really exist as a concept. So you can define them on the fly as well. So the way that it works is that if I were to put like Sandy's awesome here, then it would look for the environment called Sandy's awesome, and it wouldn't find it. So it'd just go and create that for me. Can't do that with service connections, which is a good thing. There are a few services in environments which do make it more tightly coupled, and I'll kind of explain that a little bit now. So if we come over to our environments, we can see that we have three. We have dev, we have test, and we have prod. And if I come into test, because that's already defined, we can see that I've defined in here a Kubernetes service that exists within Azure. So if we look at the types of resources that we can add to an environment, we can only add at the minute Kubernetes and virtual machines. What that means is that from an environment, we can only directly target these services without needing to, let's say, provide the endpoint for Kubernetes or the endpoint for a VM. We can just access them by name, which is what this default is, which is why we saw dev.default and test.default and prod.default. we're referencing this by name, even though the actual service in Azure is called DPE-AKS test. So we can also deploy to additional services, whether that's Azure Blob, whether it's SQL DBs, whether it's Amazon endpoints, right? You can do all of that in environments, because environments is loosely coupled, not tightly. It's about linking together your services and making some of them easier. But going back to the point of security, this is where we can start to think about the security, and we can start to look at approvals and checks. So if we come into the security, we can see that in the same way that we can do with service connections, we can specify who is actually able to access and to use this environment. But more importantly, we can start to restrict access to only specific pipelines. So we can say only the data protection engine, continuous integration pipeline, is able to use this, and that can only be administered by whoever is in this group as an administrator. The other settings within here are the approvals and checks, and this is where we have that hook back to our pre-deployment conditions. So it's a little bit segregated, and we have that same kind of aspect here. When we want to try and add a new approval, we can specify that it only runs during business hours, that we only use our master branch to deploy to this environment, only a single stage can use it at a time. And then again, some of those more advanced elements, invoking Azure functions, invoking REST APIs. This bottom one is kind of cool, the required template. That's saying that we can start to create centralized templates for YAML, and you can only actually use this environment if you are using this centralized template, which is cool. So this is how you do security on environments. And the same concept is also true within your service connections as well. So we can see here that I've got my service connections which directly tie to my Kubernetes instances that are linked to my environments. So if I come back into test, I can also think about adding checks on top of the service connection as well. And my suggestion to you guys, if you're starting to build this up, is to make sure that you have gates on your service connections. So it's pretty easy, if you haven't set up the security correctly, for somebody to bypass using an environment that you may have defined because of the way that the environments are built. They can bypass that relatively easily, but to deploy to Azure, they're going to have to either use a service connection that already exists, which is the ideal, or they're going to have to make one themselves. So from a security point of view, you can obviously stop them creating service principals. If they don't actually have access to the prod environment, they won't be able to do that anyway. So your better bet to start off with is usually the service connection, because that's the actual point that you usually authenticate with whatever you're deploying to. So this is always going to be my suggestion on where to set them up. And the approach is the same. You set the approvers, you say that Sandy is a required approver. You can set them instructions if you want. And then again, you can start to see the fact that you can't allow, you can set a setting to disallow approvers from being able to validate their own requests. So that's how you get back into the security aspect and how to lock down your environments from a CI/CD point of view. And the way that that looks within our pipeline is if I come back into the data protection, you can see that you can see the lineage of tests and approvers. So you can see here that I approved this request to be able to be deployed to the test environment, and I can start to see the actual resource that was deployed as part of that. So the actual check that is taking place on that as well. But at the same time, what we can do, and Microsoft are really trying to centralize the view of pipelines as well. We can also start to see that we have a link back to environments, right? So we can see from this single CI pipeline, CI/CD pipeline, we can see the actual environments that we have deployed to. It's a little bit harder to see the service connections, but we can certainly see the environment straight away. And if we have that service connection linked to an environment, we can start to see what it's done. So this is just showing us the lineage of what's actually happened through the logs. But we can come and we can go over to an environment and see again what's happened. We can also start to historically see what has happened in that environment as well. So where this starts to become very, very useful is when you have multiple repositories targeting a single environment. So you could have a segregated Git repo for your .NET web app, and you could have a segregated repository for your SQL backend, right? And if you use the same environment, you can come in and you can immediately see, yeah, this is deployed. This is the version that I've got of my DB. You can link it back to the actual build number. From the build number, you can link it back to a commit ID, and you can see exactly what's happened in that commit. So the whole lineage through environments, through YAML, has been built really, really well. The only thing that I'd like to see in a slightly more succinct way is that security over the top of either a service connection or an environment. So one of the things I want to get back to is how we can start to break up our pipelines a little bit. So we kind of saw this same standard deployment pipeline that we have, right? So we have 3 stages. Those 3 stages are exactly the same. How do we make that better? Right now, if I needed to add a new step, let's say a SQL DB deploy, I'd have to edit this file. I'd have to create a new task here for a deployment. I'd have to put all my settings in. I'd have to make sure that it was running on the correct environment. And then once I'd done that, I'd have to make sure that I'd copied this, I plonked it in my test, and I plonked it in my prod. So one of the additional things that Microsoft have as part of YAML pipelines now as well is decentralization, essentially. So you can start to think about how you can break apart your YAML pipelines into something significantly more simple. So what I have here is a Java project. So it's for a data protection engine. Again, let me just open this in VS Code, or I can zoom in easier. This guy. And what we can start to see is that we have broken down our Azure pipelines quite significantly. So instead of having a more complicated deployment stage, what we have is a much more simple deployment stage. So yes, it's still kind of copy paste between the actual stages. There are some reasons for that. The main ones are the conditions. So we're saying that we want all the previous conditions to have succeeded here. and all the previous stages to have succeeded, and we don't want this to be a pull request. But at the same time, we can also invert that, right? So we can say that we only want our development to deploy on a pull request. If that's the types of things that we want to set up as part of our deployment, we can totally do that. And we'll start to skip stages and see how that lineage changes as well. So one of the absolute key elements that we have here is when we come into our jobs, what we're defining instead of a load of copy paste code is a template instead. And the template is key to us because it means that we can start to make updates to our stages in just one place. So this project, as I've kind of said before, one of the things that we're doing with this is at the minute we have a dev test prod, which is exactly the same. So we're working on creating additional steps within our test environment where we'll run all of our integration testing and all of our regression testing within there as a nice piece of automation as well. And we can simply change the way that this runs by, again, adding additional tasks here. So we can add a new task. We'd add steps, and then we could add a new task within this job as well. So what that will allow us to do is to have a slightly differentiated test environment to our dev and our prod. So we can start to do things like run our integration tests as well. But what we do is we define just a second YAML, right? So this second YAML is really parameterized. So it becomes really, really generic across us deploying to any environment that we want to be able to deploy to. So this is all about uploading a Spark jar to, in this case, S3, and grabbing all of the parameters that we need, defining them at the start. So we have a VM image, a service connection, an environment, and a jar. And this service connection is really, really important in the way that this turns from being a parameter to an actual piece of text to linking back. The service connection is different from an environment in the way that it expands within YAML and some of the pre-validation that Microsoft do. So, as I said, with an environment, you can deploy to an environment that does not exist, and that environment will be created for you. So you could create Sandy's awesome, or you could use a parameter like, so here are my environments, environment test, right? And this doesn't actually link to anything in my parameters. So when it tries to expand this into the value, it won't be able to do it. So it will just leave it as this. And you will literally see an environment called $, bracket, bracket, parameters.environment underscore text, bracket, bracket, which kind of sucks. It's just something to keep an eye on, but service connections are different. And service connections, Microsoft expand the service connection and they validate it before they read in anything that is not included within the YAML. So if, for example, you wanted to have a variable group in your Azure DevOps that contains the name of your service connection, when you tried to read that in, it would fail. It would not be able to find the parameter from your variable group, right? Because of the way it does expansion. It's something that took me, honestly, a couple of days to find. And there is one teeny tiny piece of some documentation about service connections that says in that really lovely Microsoft Docs little purple box that says note, not a big red one that says error, warning, don't do this. Note, you can't do this. So if I was better at looking through docs, I'd have probably found that earlier. What's the way around it? So, like I said, the way around it is to include the service connection in your YAML, because it can only use things provided in the YAML. It sucks, but there is a nice way that you can create that and make it more generic and still being able to use it. The way that we've done it is quite simply just to have a vars YAML. So some of the things that we can't get from our variable groups, environments you can, we learned that after. We've included as part of a vars YAML, and things that are generic across the pipeline, so our version countering, our VM image, we've included here as well.
Sandy, I haven't wanted to disturb you because we started late, but there's a bunch of questions. Just quickly, do you want to do Q&A at the end or throughout?
I'll wrap this up in 5 minutes and then I'll go to the questions.
Fantastic, thank you.
No problem. So this is really one of the big kickers that we've found as part of the multi-stage YAML pipelines. That service connections are quite honestly a bit of a bitch if you don't realize how to do them. So this is what we've kind of built. You can find multiple GitHub issues around this as well. And realistically, that's where I got this from, right? So can't remember the guys on GitHub, but there are quite a few people who have done the same thing as me, bounced around the docs, not really found this, and then had a little bit of a bitch on GitHub to Microsoft. So yeah, the really simple way to do this is just to create them in your vars, right? So your service connection is probably not going to change. If it is, you'll need to do a manual action anyway. So it's kind of just remembering that, all right, I have updated my service connection. When I deploy, oh, it failed. Oh yeah, I updated my service connection name. Go in, change it. And it works. It works perfectly fine for us. We have no complaints with it. You can use dot notation as well if you want to. So it kind of makes it nice for us. It seems like the dot is the separator. So we can have a dev.service connection, test.service connection. And all we do now is we pass that as a parameter to each of the stages. So it does make it nice and clean. We're still able to load variable groups before a template, which is cool because it means that we don't have to pass the variable group name into the template. So like I said, if you were then going to do some tests and you wanted to add some steps here, and then you wanted to add a task that did some tests, and you wanted to use a variable from your variable group, then you can do that, right? You can pass that before. The way that variables work is that it inherits whatever is the most recent thing that it's seen, if there are any conflicting variable names. So it will just read this group in, and then all those variables will be loaded. You can use them in this template. You can use them outside of the template. Awesome, perfect. And then our vars YAML, we just read in at root. So you can have multiple var templates in there, which works perfectly fine. One thing you can't do is you can't have this. You can't have a template followed by a group listed at the same level. That's another one of the limitations that I've found. I'm not actually sure why this one is, to be totally honest. I found the answer to the service connection, but I've not found why you can't have a template and a group defined at the same level. If anybody knows, it'd be cool to see that in the Q&A. So yeah, okay. I think I'll kind of take a natural break here, but the way that you see the actual stages come through when you use the template, so deploy stage template or whatever you want, it comes through in the same way as these pipelines, with the stages that you can see broken up. Yes, Steve, that you can see broken up along the lineage chain. And with templates, you can use them at any level, right? So your levels are predominantly stages, followed by jobs, followed by tasks. So you can define a template to cover an entire stage or an entire job or just a task. So if you know that you have, let's say, your own specific authentication method into Azure, because you use a non-Azure Active Directory sign-on, then you could create a step that would be, a task that would be globally used across all your pipelines, and you could include it centrally and use it in that way as well. So there's a lot of flexibility that you can do with this as well. So yeah, Rich, do you want to fire some questions over to me? I guess you've maybe had a chance to look at them.
There's a lot of them. So I'm going to annoy people because I'm going to go from the bottom up because it's just easier to read this way. Nishin, I think, is making a point. So this is a statement, not a question. You can use service connection using Azure Resource Manager connection, $ variables, $Azure Manager service connection. So I will publish that. And Casper says, is there a way to reference a template that's located somewhere else, like another repo? It would be great to have a centralized templates repo so I don't have to change the same template 50 different places.
Yeah, so it's not something that I've done. It's something that I know is possible. You could kind of see that Microsoft had that intention with the service connections, right? So you can say as part of your service connection that on the security, I want it to, on the approvals and checks, that you want it to have required a specific template, and then you can go out and you can say where that specific template that it must use exists. It's not something that I have specifically done, but I know that it is possible to have that like centralized YAML, like I was saying just at the very end about you might have some very specific YAML authentication pipeline. So you can definitely do that. It's not something that I've personally done though.
Okay, fantastic. So Casper, I think the answer is a yes, and it's probably somewhere buried in a Microsoft doc. Manny asks, is there a way to pick and redeploy an old build package to an intermediate stage like test manually, not continuously deploy?
I think you can. This is a good question. I thought it'd be in here. I don't know, Manny. I should have hoped so, but it kind of looks like maybe not here. Yeah, let me see if we can have a dig around and then ping you back about that, unless anybody else knows. Okay,
so so a little bit more research we'll do, and we'll get back to you. Adam says, sorry, how did you get the GUI tasks to appear whilst editing the YAML again?
Yeah, so when you come into a YAML, so you have to do this through pipelines. So that's the only kind of kicker here. You can't go into the Git repository and then come into the YAML pipeline and edit it here. That won't come up. But if you come into the pipeline and you edit the pipeline here, then you will be able to see the sidebar. So I guess what Adam probably wants to know more is what our normal approach to this is. I don't know if there is a VS Code extension for this. If there's not, I'm going to create a user voice for it because that would be really cool. But what I tend to do is I don't particularly like editing code through Azure DevOps. You can pick the specific branch that you want to update, but what I tend to do is make my changes here and then copy and paste it into my local changes and then push it up with a commit. Usually, I'm not usually just updating one YAML file when I'm doing an update. I'm usually doing it as a load of other changes as well. So that's my preferred preference, but you can certainly edit different branches on there as well.
Okay, Nishan just commented you can deploy to a specific environment.
Yeah, so you can specify your environments in your stage and in your jobs deployment. So you specify a particular environment here. So the dot notation here is saying that we are targeting the environment called development, followed by the resource called default, and then we can specify test or prod as well. And we can also just specify free text here. So we can specify Sandy and it would create that new environment for us as well.
Cool. Okay. Right. Danny asks, can service connections be created in the command line and then integrated into Azure DevOps?
I don't know, to be honest. So the service connections, you can specify their connection mode. So one of the new things that Microsoft have created is you can now specify managed identity as well, which is cool. Service connections tend to be the default. So you have the automatic, which is Microsoft will go and they will create a service connection in your Azure tenant for you. So you need to have enough access within the subscription to be able to give that service principal the connectivity it needs as well. You can manually specify a service connection. I would have thought you can probably use an API for this. Most of Azure DevOps you can use APIs for now. So I would have thought that there might be the capability to create a service connection with the CLI or with an API.
Okay, still got 7 questions left, but we'll try and go through them as quickly as possible. Adam asks, can you view multi-stage YAML in the old format using the GUI, or once in the YAML can't view in the old method?
You can't view it in the old method. So yeah, you can come in and you can see individual settings like I kind of showed, but you can't just graphically see everything one step after the other. Yeah, it is one of the things that I would like to see as well. Looking at lots of YAML does kind of make your eyes strain a little bit. So if you could, in the same kind of way that you have like a few tools that are good at visualizing ARM template deployments, yeah, if there was something where you could view it and what it was going to do, that would be kind of nice to see. So no, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, great. So I think you've answered this already, but I'll ask you again. Which editor would you use to create, edit YAML files? VS Code? If so, which extensions?
So I personally just use VS Code. I don't actually use Visual Studio that much anymore. And I tend to kind of, like I said, edit things in here and drag it over. I'm honestly not sure if there are any good extensions for YAML. If there are, it'd be really cool to for somebody to post if they know any, because I'm sure there's a lot of people here who would make lots of use of that.
Yeah. So a couple of questions from Nishan, who asked, what's the best way to handle secrets? So
it depends where your secrets are are at what point. So your service connections will hide the credentials. So if you have to, let's say, sorry, I've lost service connections here. So let's say that we were wanting to authenticate with AWS. When we put in our secret access key and things like that, when we look at the service connection after, that will be completely redacted for us. There's no way for us to be able to visualize that. One of the other things that you can do is use your libraries. So your libraries will allow you to create redacted secrets. So you can see that we have an artifact publish token. What we do as part of this repository is we publish to a Maven feed that exists within our ADO, so we can consume that in other projects, and we can create an access token, which is literally a PAT from ADO, and we can plonk that in here. And as you can see, I can't see it at all. I can edit it, but I can't see it. So it depends how complex your solution is. If it's not too complex, then you can use variable groups. One of the things that you can see here is if you have more of a kind of centralized, larger project where you might have multiple teams deploying to a single environment, you can start to think about using things like Azure Key Vaults. And the really cool thing with Azure DevOps pipelines now is, frankly, this option. So we can now say, I want a whole variable group to be connected to an Azure Key Vault, which is really cool because it means that everything is in that kind of like HSM backed key storage from Microsoft as well. So it depends on how complex you want to go. Service connections, can't see the password. Simple project, probably a library with a secret. It just means that it's a bit harder to manage that if it's going to expire. And then more complex, more centralized, you might want to think about Key Vault.
Okay, great. So we second question Nishan had was, we have used task groups and library previously, and we are using multiple YAML files with template to do the same. What's the recommended way to do the same with YAML?
The same for task groups. So that probably goes into one of the areas that I've actually not looked into too much, which is to have those that kind of centralized YAML that is consumable by other teams. So I'm kind of guesstimating here, but I would have thought the way that it works is you probably have like a central repository of templates that you can keep up to date that are all defined in YAML, and then your consumers can go and they can use part of that within their templates. So you can also, for example, in multi-stage YAML pipelines, but also in your traditional editor, you can have a pipeline that is that picks up from multiple repositories, so you can do that as well. So that's probably how the integration with templates for like centralization will work. So I'd probably suggest having a look about how you can create like a central Git repository that all your teams can access and be able to drag down the templates that they need.
Okay, great. I think Cyril's expressed this point as well, so I'll just publish this. Mark says, should be able to create the service connections through the Azure DevOps REST API. So yes, you could then do that through PowerShell. I was going to suggest the same thing because I think that that I've done something before in a project quite early on with the REST API, similar to this with service connections.
Yeah, so it makes sense because I know some of the patterns that you have are populating your variable groups, to be quite honest. So you will deploy like a SQL DB, and you'll generate the username and password as something on the fly. So one of the patterns that we like to use is to create a random string for the username and password based off a salt with the resource group identifier. So that means that every time the pipeline runs, that we will generate the secret, but it will be the same secret. And it means that we don't have to predefine a SQL username and password. So what we do is we inject that into the variable group so it's usable by other resources as well. So it would make sense to be able to do things like service connections because the APIs are pretty good for ADO.
Fantastic. Okay, so last two questions from Casper. On approvals, let's say a developer wants to deploy to prod and you've set the approvers to the group developers. How do you prevent the developer requesting the release from being able to approve it in YAML?
So it's not in YAML. That's the key. So there's nothing you can do in YAML, but the service connections and also the environments have that one setting that I showed a couple of times, which is, in the approvals and checks. So when you specify a group, so let's go back to, what's this project? This is Nottingham Scratchpad. So if I have a look at the, if I add an approval, if I add the Nottingham Scratchpad, I know that I am a member of this because I'm in it. But what I can do is disable this setting, which by default is enabled, which is to allow approvers to approve their own runs. So essentially, this will just block me from being able to approve anything that I have created the PR and the commit for to this specific service connection. So you can do that for all of your service connections. It's how you can get a group and then just stop that one dev that's like, yeah, well, I did it and then I approved all my changes and now it's in prod. Any more, Rich?
Sorry, it was muted. One of the main advantages of the classic release tab is the overview you're getting. You can see when something's been deployed, to which environment, which tag or commit has triggered it, which artifact is connected to it, which commits are included in the release. Is there a way to get the same overview with the YAML pipelines? I know that you can see deployments under environments, but that's not as useful as the releases tab.
So yeah, I think what Microsoft are trying to do with the multi-stage YAML. So I'm just going to show you two different bits because we've got our tests and code coverage here, but my other side has the deployment. So the only reason that this isn't showing deployment is simply because we haven't got a deployment in here. But if you imagine this page connected to the next one that I'm going to show, then that's basically the view. So you can see from your actual build run, and this is a whole run, you can see the changes that have been linked with specific commit IDs. You can go through that, and you can also see tests that have run. You can obviously start to change your filters. So you can see the actual test names that have run. This links up in the exact same way that the old test runner did. So you can see degradation through time. When you see a specific test failure, it will tell you how many times in the last week or so it's failed. And then you can link your code coverage report, which I expected to open. Okay, I'm not sure why that isn't opening. It should be an XML, but we can see the code coverage that we have from this as well. You can see your artifacts that are part of it. Okay, our code coverage is part of our artifacts rather than published. So we can open this as a HTML, and we can see all the other elements that come through with it. We can see our actual build artifacts, our jars as well. And like you said, you can see your repository, your branch that's triggered it, the most recent commit ID as well, and any linked work items that would have gone with that pull request as well. And then if I just come over to this other sample, what you can also then see from this same just specific run is you can see the environments tab, which allows you to see what it's actually targeted. You can drop into that environment to see what it's actually gone and done, and you can see any associated pipelines. So this associated pipeline is the pull request. So the way that we had this running is that the pull request only triggered a build, and then the deployment stages only ran on the actual update to master. So all of that lineage is dealt with pretty well by Microsoft, being able to see all of those kind of elements linked together from the actual artifacts to commit IDs, as we saw in the other pipeline, and all those kind of little changes that we'd expect can all be packaged together just in the pipelines, and then the specific pipeline, and then the specific run that you're after as well.
Okay, perfect. So comments and questions still coming in. One from Manny. I think this multi-stage pipeline concept is suited for continuous integration and continuous deployment, but not for release management. Maybe they intend us not to go down the route of separate release management and instead adopt DevOps principles.
Ooh. Yeah, I mean, certainly from the CI/CD side, it's all good. It'd be good to get your view on the whole change management stuff as well, Manny. So Manny works. I assume it's our Manny.
Yeah, I think so.
That's giving me a good ribbon here. So I'm sure we can catch up over a beer after I'm allowed out of my house again. Getting on this.
Yep, and Darren has said the publish code coverage task doesn't really like Jacoco. Cobertura XML works much better.
Okay, this is me trying to take credit for Darren's work, so so he knows. In that case, Darren, I'll have to show you my other pipeline for one of the customers that does publish it quite nicely.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. I can't believe we've actually got so many people at the end of this. We normally have quite a lot of dropouts. So clearly multi-stage pipelines is a big hit, and is a part of everybody's day-to-day now. Thanks to anybody that's still here. Just thank you very much for all of the feedback regarding next things that we can publish through the group and types of talks. And I'm going to go away and I'm going to find some speakers for some of those topics. So we'll hopefully have an interesting program coming up. And just lastly, I want to say a special thank you for Sandy for a great talk, very sort of demo driven and interactive, which is our favorite type. Thanks everyone, and I will follow up through Meetup and post the recordings. Try and maybe edit out the bits where there were silence. Thank you, everyone.
So one of the things
everyone, guys.
For anyone still here as well is I'm just going to make a very generic sample of this and dump it out on GitHub so you guys can all see it. I'll send that over to Rich so we can post it to the group as well. It'll just be like a quick jump starter.
Thanks everyone, and good night.